네, 굿모닝인포맥스 2부 이번에는 핵심 경제 이슈를 풀어보는 시간이죠. 경제언박싱 시간입니다.
네, 오늘도 깊이 있는 소식을 쉽고 정확하게 풀어보겠습니다. 오늘은 서영태 기자가 해외 전문가 인터뷰를 준비해왔다고 하는데요. 인터뷰 대상이 누구냐? 요즘 이 글로벌 시장에서 최고의 채권 아시아 전문가로 인정받는 분인데요. 스탠다드차타드 은행의 카시크루드라 글로벌 픽스드 인컴 헤드 겸 아시아 리서치 헤드인데요. 그럼 먼저 스튜디오에 나와 있는 서영태 기자와 인사를 나눠보겠습니다. 안녕하세요.
네, 안녕하십니까?
네. 전 세계적인 유동성 긴축이 연말이 되니까 내년 성장률 전망, 국내외 성장률 전망이 굉장히 지금 핫한 이슈가 됐는데요. 좀 아까 이민재 기자도 얘기했지만 내년 성장률 전망이 정부가 이제 1% 중반 후반대 이렇게 얘기했나. 올해는 2% 중반대 정도로 추정은 되고 있잖아요. 그렇죠? 뭐 거의 뭐 반토막 심리적으로 반토막이 난다는 얘기인데 인터뷰에서 어떤 내용이 나왔습니까? 좀?
예, 말씀하신 대로 지금 연말이고 하다 보니까 좀 내년 경제가 어떻게 될지 좀 관심이 많이 쏠리고 있는 것 같습니다. 경제 전문가 중에 상당수가 내년에 뭐 경제 침체가 위기가 온다 이런 이야기도 많고요. 하기 때문에 그럼 외국인의 시각에서 비춰본 우리 한국의 현재 금융시장 상황과 또 한국 경제 내년 한국 경제 상황은 어떨까 또 궁금하고 또 전망도 궁금하고 해서 인터뷰를 진행했고 또 아시아 경제 전문가다 보니까 우리 한국에도 굉장한 중요한 경제국인 중국과 인도 경제에 대해서도 또 들어볼 좋을 기회라고 생각해가지고 또 인터뷰를 진행을 했습니다. 인터뷰 영상 준비했으니까 함께 일단 보시겠습니다.
I think it is, I mean, from an outside perspective, obviously, people are looking at Korea with a fair amount of interest. But that said, I think they do see this as a very specific, very localized event for now. Clearly, Bank of Korea has been on a hiking process and obviously trying to sort of address what was happening in terms of the housing market dynamics. And I feel that the Bank of Korea has actually done a fairly good job with respect to rate hikes, which have allowed inflation to have peaked. Growth obviously is starting to come down. You have housing market obviously starting to correct, which is what they set out to achieve. Unfortunately, what is happening from here on to some extent is not completely in Korea's hands. Like, it's true for a lot of other countries around the world as well. I think we are facing higher inflationary pressures in the West, and which requires very restrictive policies from the Fed and other central banks, and that is creating challenges for a lot of EM central banks where they have to hike rates primarily to ensure financial stability. And I think that's what Korea is facing, and that it creates a situation where you could have more stress come into the housing market, because obviously a lot of the housing or the borrowing is linked to floating rate in Korea, and I think that clearly creates a little bit of a challenge for the Korean Korean housing market, and what that means for sort of institutions that are obviously linked to that. But that said, I think at this point it is seen as a localized event. There will be some spillover effect for other credit in Korea, and we've seen obviously, as we were discussing earlier as well, I think Korean offshore bonds have also seen some spread widening. But I think investors will also see that as an opportunity to add Korean paper to their portfolios. I think Korea, after all, over the years has been a story where there's a fair amount of deleveraging that has happened, particularly in the offshore market. I mean, when I look at and I remember Korea from back in 2008, Korea was a relatively large issuer in the market, and there was a lot of debt outstanding in the dollar space. Since then, I think there has been a very active program to reduce dependence on foreign borrowing and obviously focus more on domestic borrowing. So to that extent, I think even though spreads could widen, I think that's an opportunity for investors to perhaps look at the names that they've always wanted, but they were too tight. Now they can get them at slightly better levels. Sure. Now, I think it's a good question. Now, listen, I think Korea is not alone in facing pressure in the housing market right now. If you have rates going up everywhere, you will see mortgage rates going up, and obviously that will start impacting buyers' demand for housing around the world, and that's happening in the U.S. I mean, with mortgage rates at 7%, it's become almost unaffordable for a buyer to look to the housing market, for instance. Korea, I think getting back to Korea and looking at Asia, I think Korea will certainly see perhaps more defaults in that space, more pressure for sure, and that will clearly, if that sector is going to be under pressure, I think there will be other borrowers, other institutions which could come under more pressure. I think the clear impact of that typically happens on the banking sector for most countries. I think good news for Korea is that Korean banks are in good shape. Again, having gone through their crisis about 10, 15 years back, I think today the Korean banking sector is in much better shape. It's well capitalized. I don't think necessarily it's going to be too much of a problem. Obviously, no banking system wants to see high levels of default and credit problems in the system. But if you do have that, I think Korean banks are in pretty good shape to sort of be able to take that shock. Now, elsewhere in Asia, we don't necessarily to the same extent, we don't necessarily see dependence on mortgage lending. Obviously, there's some markets where mortgage lending is quite prevalent, but in a lot of other markets, mortgage lending represents a relatively smaller portion of the overall, funding mix. Now, there will be some markets in Asia where we will see more pressure, and I think clearly this is not localized to Korea. Korea is obviously facing a particularly strong liquidity crunch, primarily because of BOK being early in the rate hiking cycle and being proactive. In other Asian central banks have been much more, I guess they have joined this rate hiking cycle a little later in the process. So we may actually see that later. But we are not necessarily seeing the same level of pressure. The other market, obviously, we have seen some amount of pressure has been China. Clearly the Chinese real estate sector has been under pressure for some time. But the measures announced earlier in this week should help. They've also obviously provided some support, in the months leading up to this. That perhaps was not quite there because they were trying to instill demand into that sector. But what they have done now is sort of supporting the developers, which will really help that sector from a medium-term perspective. Yeah, so I think those are very good questions. I think growth will clearly come under pressure, but our expectations for Korean growth is still in the low twos. So well above 2%, but obviously not significantly above 2, somewhere between 2 and 2.5 is our expectation on growth for next year. Obviously coming down from where we were this year, but obviously I think that level of growth is achievable. I think in terms of rate hikes, BOK has very clearly telegraphed that they expect, or their preference is to keep rates somewhere between 0 and minus 50 basis points in real terms. And their own expectation of inflation next year is 370. So our expectation is obviously that they will probably want to keep it in that range. Now, given what we are seeing, their ideal position probably would be where we are right now. But I think given sort of the overall dynamics that they have to manage, including what the Fed is likely to do, I think Bank of Korea probably will have to hike a couple of more times and take it up to about 375. Yeah, I mean, I think Chinese growth obviously has been very weak this year. We're obviously going to get growth in the low 3%, which is obviously very weak for China. And as you highlighted, I think the two main factors there have been their zero COVID stance, which has kept large parts of the economy closed, and the ailing real estate sector. Now, the good news is that the authorities have announced measures on both those fronts in the last week. I think starting with, although they have, not explicitly provided any, guidelines as to how they're going to open up the economy with respect to COVID, they're, clearly signaling that the economy will get opened up and they're going to relax these measures over time. I think it's going to be a gradual process. You still have the winter ahead. we will still see vaccination, the need for vaccination go up, and I think particularly for the elderly, you'll probably need to see more action on that front. We see more meaningful opening up of the economy from COVID happening only from Q2 of next year. But I think some measures to sort of that effect will already have kicked in from now, and we'll see the benefit of that. The second aspect is really around real estate, and as I mentioned earlier, I think real estate is a major driver of the Chinese economy, and it clearly has been hurting for the last year and a half, I'd say. I think certainly on that front, the announced measures which allow developers to access funding, and that has really been the biggest challenge for developers to be able to access funding. Now, with funding being available, they can perhaps complete some of the stalled projects. They can actually move forward with some of the projects that had been completely stopped. Government has also provided additional funding to sort of help with that stall project thing. So I think all of these should really start helping the real estate sector. And I think the impact of all of this will be felt more strongly in the second half of next year. And I think that's when we will see a growth pick up. Our expectation of growth for the full year of 2023 is 5.8%, which is reasonably healthy for China. Obviously, still a few things need to go right to get to those numbers. So there's perhaps a little bit more risk to the downside, but our now expectation is for 5.8 for next year, so which is reasonably healthy. Now, as I mentioned, I think growth is going to be more skewed towards the second half of next year, and it is going to be largely driven by opening up of the economy, which is going to be very domestically focused, right? So the knock-on positive impact for rest of the world and for Asia, for that matter, is going to be less than we've seen in the past. So while Korean exports to China should improve, because China opens up, obviously their domestic consumption will increase, but it's probably not going to be as strong as you would expect from a stronger growth number as we've seen in the past. So we will see that. We'll probably see it more in the second half of next year, and perhaps less muted compared to what we've seen in the past. No, the economy actually is amongst the bigger economies from a GDP standpoint. It is one of the fastest growing economies of the world. Even for next year, we expect it to be relatively healthy, although there'll be some moderation of growth, but growth rate will still be relatively healthy. Obviously, the consumer sector, the services sector, all of these things are contributing strongly to the economy. I think the one challenge India, I think there is still more rate hikes to be done, because the central bank probably needs to address the inflation issue and bring inflation fully under control. So we do expect more in terms of rate hikes, but the economy in general, the monetary transmission is not as strong as you would see in a developed economy. So I think in a relative sense, that should have relatively less impact on an economy which is primarily domestically driven, domestic consumer driven, not even domestic investment driven. And from that standpoint, you should see the economy, growing at a reasonable pace. The Indian economy grows at a relatively healthy, above 5%, even if you don't do much in terms of policy support. With policy support and perhaps other things coming through, because also we have to remember in 2024 you have elections coming up again. So given that in mind, 2023 is probably going to be a year where there's going to be probably more fiscal spending. And when you get more fiscal spending, growth will benefit from that. And I think that should set us up reasonably well for a stronger second half of next year, and then leading up to 2024 as well. See, I think if I took a snapshot of the story, say 2 years back, before COVID happened, China was issuing so much paper that there was oversupply of Chinese debt in people's portfolios, and sort of, in terms of what was happening from an issuance standpoint. And people wanted to see diversification of their portfolio. So they wanted to see credits from other markets, including Korea, including other parts of Asia. So what that meant is there's going to be a relatively large pool of savings looking for assets around the world, and Korean assets in particular, because they're high quality, but their spreads got extremely tight. Now, I think an opportunity has presented itself, like we talked about earlier in the discussion, where Korean spreads are a little bit more attractive versus where they were before. People are still looking for diversification candidates. So Korea clearly, should benefit from that. Now, the thing I would say, though, is we have to divide up the Chinese credit market in two separate segments. There's the Chinese investment grade sector and the Chinese high yield sector. What really has been under pressure is the Chinese high yield sector. And Chinese high yield is not necessarily a peer group for Korea, right? The peer group for Korea really is the Chinese investment grade sector. And that actually has done relatively okay despite this turmoil that we've seen. Also, additional factor that has really supported demand for Chinese investment grade dollar debt is the dollar actually has been very strong. The US dollar has been very strong. And for investors sitting in China, if you are expecting the CNY to weaken against the dollar, buying dollar debt, which is a very natural jurisdiction for you in any case, makes a lot of sense. So I think they've been the biggest supporters and the biggest buyers of their own debt issued in US dollars. And so I think that debt has actually performed reasonably well. It's the high yield sector which has got severely beaten. As you rightly said, it's trading at distressed levels. Obviously, it's come up a little bit in the last few days because of the announcements by the government, but it's still trading at a very cheap level.
네, 카시크 루드라 헤드의 아주 글로벌 전체적인 그리고 한국 관련된 멘트를 들어보셨는데요. 서영태 기자, 들어보니까 제 귀에는 일단 이 루드라 헤드가 얘기한 것 중에 한국 내년 경제 성장률이 일단 저는 제일 이제 눈여겨봤는데
네.
정부는 1% 중후반대를 보고 있는데 카시크 루드라 헤드는 2.5%까지를 보고 있어요. 내년에는 좀 고무적이라고 생각하고 금리는 정리하자면 기준금리는 조금 더 앞으로도 올릴 가능성은 있지만 성장률은 우리 정부만큼은 아니고 올해와 비슷한 수준에서 유지가 될 것이다. 이렇게 좀 받아들이면 될까요?
일단은 그 경제 성장률 이야기를 하셨는데 저도 이 부분 좀 흥미로웠습니다. 한국은행이 지난주에 통화정책 방향을 결정을 하면서 기준금리 결정했고 또 내년 경제 성장률을 발표했는데 기존에 8월에 2.1%로 전망했다가 1.7%로 확 낮췄잖아요.
그렇죠. 근데
아직 IMF는 한 2% 정도로 전망하고 있고 지금 스탠다드차타드 같은 경우도 2%대 초반이 가능하다고 본 거거든요. 근데 한국은행 같은 경우는 내년 세계 경제가 많이 어두워지면서 우리나라 경제도 어려움을 겪을 수밖에 없다. 뭐 이런 논리인데 그런데 비춰보면은 카시크 루드라 같은 경우는 내년 세계 경제를 조금 더 낙관하고 있는 거 아닌가라는 좀 해석이 좀 돼요. 그 이유 중 하나가 한국과 관련되어 있는 주요국에 대해서도 제가 여쭤봤는데 또 그 주요국 경제에 대해서 그렇게 부정적인 평가를 내리지 않으셨거든요. 그렇기 때문에 그런 글로벌 뷰에서 다른 한국과 관련된 주요 경제 교육들을 보고 그런 점을 이제 생각하셔서 좀 낙관적으로 본 게 아닌가 그렇게 생각이 들고요. 그리고 한국은행이 또 6차례 연속 금리를 올리면서 올해 마지막 금통위에서 3.0%, 3.25%로 올렸죠. 결국 최종 금리는 3.75%로 전망을 했는데 앞으로는 2번 더 남았다는 전망인데 여기에 대해서는 또 근거가 또 재밌습니다. 일단 한국은행이 실질 금리를 제로에서 마이너스 0.5%로 만드는 걸 선호한다 이렇게 이야기를 하셨잖아요. 실질 금리라는 건 명목 금리에서 인플레이션을 뺀 건데 명목 금리라는 게 이제 한국은행이 이제 3.75%까지 3.25%라고 하고 내년 경제 성장률, 내년 물가 상승률을 3.6으로 봤는데 그렇다면은 이제 한 마이너스 0.35 정도 되잖아요.
그렇죠.
그러니까 합리적인 범위 루드라 헤드가 생각하시기에 합리적인 범위인 거고 여기서도 올릴 수도 있을 것이라 올릴 것이라고 보는 어떤 범위를 보신 거기 때문에 3.75라는 전망을 또 계속해서 또 유지를 하실 것 같고 사실은 금통위 전에 인터뷰를 했기 때문에 지금은 또 해석이 좀 바뀌셨을지도 모르겠습니다만은 일단은 3.75%로 보시고 계시면 계십니다.
인도 경제도 전망을 했잖아요.
예.
뭐 애플도 생산의 무게 중심을 이제 중국에서 인도로 옮긴다라는 이야기도
예.
있고, 이제 미중 갈등도 이제 계속되는 상황에서 내년도 상대적으로 괜찮을 거라고 본다라는 이야기를 했습니다. 이 전망을 좀 어떻게 정리해 볼 수 있을까요?
예, 인도 경제가 좀 많이 흥미로워요. 인도 경제가 왜냐면은 G3라는 이야기가
예,
나올
나오더라고요.
정도로 뭐 급부상하고 있거든요. 예, 원래 이제 91년도부터 이제 개방형 시장 경제를 전환한 이후에 한 30년간 꾸준히 한 6.5%, 4% 정도 성장률을 유지를 해왔거든요.
네.
근데 중국이 너무나도 빨리 컸기 때문에 중국에 좀 가려 있었는데 이제 다시 이제 중국이 이제 고령화를 겪고 경제 성장 동력이 떨어져 간다 이런 얘기를 듣고 또 미국으로부터 견제를 받는다 뭐 이런 상황에서 인도 같은 경우는 인구가 되게 질적 양적으로 우수해요.
네.
이렇게 훌륭한 아시아 전문가도 계시고 근데 미국의 빅테크 구글이나 마이크로소프트에도 다 인도계 CEO들이
그렇죠.
또 있잖아요.
네.
그러면서 또 젊은 인구가 많아가지고 내수랑 소비도 많이 기대가 되고 있고 생산성도 많이 높을 것으로 기대가 되고 있거든요. 따라서 이제 중장기적으로 제조업 경쟁력 개선과 함께 거대 소비 시장으로 떠올릴 것이기 때문에 또 미국의 공조가 또 강한 아시아 인도 태평양 전략 속에서 공조가 강해지면은 또 중국을 대신하는 생산기지 제2의 중국으로서 예, 많은 또 매력을 갖고 인도의 역할이 세계 경제 속에서 커질 것으로 전망이 되고 있습니다.
네. 앞으로도 이 세계적인 이 유명한 분석가들의
예.
인터뷰들 좀 많이 좀 부탁하겠습니다. 특히 연말 전망 관련해서는
예.
여러 의견을 좀 들을 필요가 있을 것 같습니다.
맞아요.
네, 오늘 여기까지 할까요?
예.
네. 예, 서영태 기자 앞으로 좋은 인터뷰 부탁드리겠습니다.
네, 고맙습니다.
예, 깊이가 다른 경제뉴스 연합뉴스 경제TV 경제를 읽으려면 꼭 알아야 될 이슈들을 풀어보는 경제언박싱 여기서 인사드리겠습니다.
네, 시청해주신 여러분 감사드리고요. 저희는 내일 이 시간에 다시 찾아뵙겠습니다.
네, 지금까지 김경훈
성유미였습니다.
고맙습니다.
고맙습니다.